Right. Hello, I am Jennifer Hopkinson. I am the counseling program manager with a nonprofit called Clackamas Women's Services that serves survivors of domestic and sexual violence. And I have been working with survivors since 2008. And I'm going to go ahead and attempt to share my screen and my slides, and we'll see how this goes. All right, did that work? Can you see my screen okay? Why can I not see the Zoom?
We can see the screen. You haven't actually started your slideshow though.
Right. How about now?
Yeah, it's the presenter's version of it is what we're looking at.
That's not what I want. Okay, 1 second. Okay.
I think when you click on share screen with PowerPoint, right, you just, once you start it, if you just have to click on the window that shows the full slide, I think.
Having trouble that it's going to a different screen. Let me try it this way. I apologize, folks. How's that?
Great, we can see it. It's going.
Okay. All right. Okay, so let's see. This is my agenda today. Some of the clinical considerations I'm going to go through pretty quickly. Chris has already talked about a lot of those in other parts of this training series. And I have also included a lot of example language that I just want you to have, but it will be in the slides available to you after the fact. So I'm not going to go in depth about some of those pieces too, because I want to get to the parts about actual safety planning. So forgive me if I go quickly on some parts, and I will try to go more in depth on some of the parts that I feel are most important to cover. I want to be mindful that this is tough stuff to talk about, so please take care of yourself. Again, the information is available to you after the fact, and also that we're not going to talk about the needs of all survivors for safety planning, right? So be thinking about, in any safety planning that you do with the folks that you work with, using an equity lens, being aware of your biases, being aware of the biases present in the systems and the resources that you may be referring to. A note on screening. I know that Chris has already covered a lot of this, but I just want to mention it again, that screening is really valuable, regardless of whether someone discloses to you. It's an opportunity to start that conversation, to show that it's important and it's something that we talk about. And just one conversation can make a difference, right? One touch point, one interaction can help folks be more likely to access an intervention or even to leave a dangerous situation. I also want to really encourage being very clear up front with the folks you work with about any mandatory reporting status that you might have. We know that these laws exist to protect vulnerable folks, right? And they're important and they save lives and they protect folks. But when folks are in a situation that may be controlling or abusive and a report gets made, things don't always get safer, and sometimes they can even become more dangerous. There might be risk of retaliation. Folks might kind of drop out of services afterwards as a result. So always being wherever you can, even in first conversations before folks come into services, being upfront about reporting and your status, and making sure that folks have an informed option about what they want to share and can be involved if any report does need to get made. I have a link at the end in the resources from Futures Without Violence about mandatory reporting with survivors that gives some helpful guidance around that if it does come up for you. And I won't talk more. I could talk for an entire training about this topic, but I just want to kind of plant that seed. And again, here's kind of some language about how to bring this up, how to offer resources, knowing that maybe you've got some great pamphlets or handouts from a local domestic violence service organization. It might not be safe for somebody to take that with them. Or even if you develop a safety plan with someone that you're working with, they may not be able to take that, right? We don't want to be giving folks stuff that could put them at further risk if someone were to find it. So kind of trusting to them and their what they say about whether it's safe to take it with them or not. Also encourage you to screen about the possibility of whether partners may interfere with treatment, right? This is something that happens a lot. Remember that domestic violence and interpersonal violence are about power and control. And so if someone is getting access to help, access to support, a partner who wants to have control may perceive that as threatening and may seek to interfere. So being aware of ways that that partner may be looking to interfere and screening for that as well, and thinking about that in terms of the treatment that you're offering. Again, some language about how to ask for that. This resource at the bottom comes from the National Center for Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health. That is a fantastic resource. I strongly encourage you to check it out. They have so much great research and all kinds of information, including a lot of the infographics that you'll see in my slides. They come straight from them. Oh, you have that toolbar? Let me move that over. Did that help? Was that better?
Perfect.
Thanks. All right. And I really want to encourage you to find out about the domestic violence, sexual violence services organizations that are close to you that you can refer to. I want you to be prepared to do safety planning yourself with your clients, but know that you don't have to be the full expert on that, right? And the more connections you can provide for your patients, for your clients, the less isolated they are. You want them to have a team, right? Just like if somebody was experiencing mental health crisis or suicidality, you would offer a mental health crisis line, offer a domestic violence crisis line, and know that that's something that you can document, right, for your own liability. And it can be a resource for you as well. You can call those hotlines and ask for input, ask for resources, ask for guidance. They're available often 24 hours. They may have support groups available that you can refer your clients to. They may offer advocates who can go to court with folks, who can safety plan, who can, they may have legal advice resources. They may even be mobile and able to come and meet with your client at your clinic or at your office. All of that is to your benefit and to your client's benefit to connect with. The ideal connection is a warm handoff. We know, right, for trauma survivors that the more information that we can give about what to expect, and the more we can describe what it's going to be like when they go there or when they make that call, the better. And again, here's some more kind of examples of language. If somebody is reluctant to call, you can, demonstrate for them what it's like to call so that they can see and hear what it's like. Being very clear that you're not going to give their information, right? And this helps build trust too when you say, here's what I'm going to do, here's what I'm going to say, and then they see that that's exactly what happens. Again, more language. If they are interested in connecting, you can step out of the room. If you're worried about that mandatory reporting piece, generally speaking, folks who are advocates in domestic violence services organizations are not mandatory reporters in the state of Oregon. That's on purpose, because we know that sometimes when a report gets made, it can increase risk, right? So different folks play different roles in the system to help create safety. And so you can offer that and then step out of that conversation if they prefer that, and if that kind of helps eliminate that concern. Also, being aware that folks may or may not disclose to you, and you may feel some question about what they disclose, right? Folks are all survivors are human beings, and they may not always give you all the information. They may also share things that sound implausible, and I've certainly worked with folks where I may have had questions about, is this real? Could this really be happening? And unfortunately, a lot of the time it is things that even sound really, really kind of wild. turn out to be true in terms of, the person, partner stalking them and having information that there's no other way that they could have, but just kind of keeping that compassion, and also keeping in mind that, when a person is struggling in a relationship that is controlling or abusive, they often have deep love for that person, right? They don't necessarily want to leave. And if you are able to create space for that love or that care that they have for that person, you're going to have a better alliance, a better rapport, and a better opportunity to really support that survivor and what they want, as opposed to telling folks that they need to leave or criticizing that partner. Helping someone believe in the capacity of their partner to change and do better, and believe in their own right to safety, is a loving act. And compassion for yourself too, right? It's hard to work with folks where you know that they're at risk of harm, and maybe you're seeing them go back over and over, even. That's tough. And so, remembering that you're also witnessing resilience and healing and getting support for yourself. If somebody does disclose, if you are working with someone where you have those concerns, thinking about safety, right? Thinking about hierarchy of needs. And this may even mean modifying treatment, like what is most important for that person, right? We have folks who, we have a program where folks come in through a lethality assessment with law enforcement. And we find that, sometimes there are priorities that are just bigger than counseling. And that may mean, getting a protective order or moving or getting to safety first. And so sometimes it may be necessary to, if you can be more flexible, if you can expect that survivors may need to cancel more than other clients might, whatever way you're able to accommodate that can be really, really helpful to keep folks engaged and keep them getting the support that they need. Be aware that when folks experience domestic violence, they may have an increased risk of suicide, of substance use disorder, of major depression, and especially if folks are going through court, that's a real hard time, right? And big decisions are being made, big things, a lot of power taken away, a lot of choices taken away, and those are times to really think about supporting people. So I'm sure that for all of you, you have a lot of experience and training, hopefully, right? Supporting folks around suicidality. But thinking about, this is Thomas Joiner's theory about why people die by suicide. Perceived burdensomeness, often for survivors, their partner may be using emotional strategies to make them feel like a burden that may be present for them. Thwarted belongingness, right? Often the threat of the family breaking up, the threat of loss of connection is part of that experience. And then they may have exposure to violence in the relationship, and that can increase the capability of serious attempt or death by suicide, right? So really screening for that, safety planning for that, alongside safety planning around potential violence in the relationship. There's lots of training available. There's free training available. Strongly encourage the counseling on access to lethal means training. That's definitely relevant. We'll talk about that a little bit more later too, in safety planning around violence in the relationship. Some things may indicate a higher danger, higher lethality situation. If the survivor is pregnant, if there are children that are not the abusive partners, if the partner that is behaving abusively is unemployed, using substances, if there's access to lethal weapons, lethal means, any credible threat or threat to or attempt to kill the survivor, strangulation indicates much higher lethality. Self-harm also, right, or threats to end their own life from the partner who's behaving abusively. If the person you're working with believes or even has a feeling that that person could or would kill them, it's really important to take that very, very seriously. And also, of course, stalking behaviors. So here's the things that I need you to know, right? Shelter and housing are the most requested services. We get calls all the time, folks wanting to leave. They don't have access to other housing, right? And it is the least available thing. It is just incredibly limited. Shelters are generally full. They often don't allow pets. They may require folks be substance free. And if anyone is, struggling with an addiction, that can be a tremendous barrier. So just, knowing that folks aren't going to be able to just up and leave and go to a shelter, that's extremely unlikely. Not all situations would benefit from a restraining order. A restraining order can help if the partner behaving abusively is responsive to law enforcement intervention, responsive to those consequences. It may be a helpful option. Some folks aren't. Some folks may escalate. The danger may increase, right? The survivor is going to have a gut feeling about that. And it's important to kind of listen to that too, because we don't want to be increasing the risk with our recommendations. And you'll note on here, I had put that to obtain a restraining order, there has to have been an act of violence or an explicit threat in the last 180 days. That's just in the state of Oregon. I want to clarify, laws are different for restraining orders in different locations. So that may not be true where you are. Make sure that, if that's something that the survivor is wanting to do, that you look into the details. And this is different for accessing domestic violence services at an organization where there's advocacy. They have a much broader definition. People don't have to be experiencing physical violence. So I just want to clarify that eligibility to access support services may be very, very different than eligibility to get into a shelter or to access a restraining order. And that, going through court processes, participating in prosecution of crimes can be really, really lengthy, can involve a lot of re-traumatization, to be very honest. And, for parents, it is not, people rarely get the outcome that they hope for. And even when there is accountability through court processes, I would say that for a lot of survivors, it's rarely what they might really have hoped for. For a lot of folks, they feel very disappointed in outcomes, even when there is some accountability. And just in general, that sometimes staying is the safest option, right? We know that it can take 7 to 9 times before survivors are able to successfully leave an abusive relationship. And so being prepared to offer safety planning and options to increase safety, regardless of whether somebody is wanting to leave or ready to leave or feels that it's safe to leave. Thinking of it as like harm reduction, right? We want to help somebody be safer in the situation that they're in. We want to support their self-determination as much as possible. In a situation where someone is being controlling and abusive to their partner, a lot of their choices have already been taken away. Someone else is already telling them what to do, maybe a lot of the time, right? So if we're able to help them listen to their own gut and kind of rebuild that internal connection with what they need and what is safe for them, that is part of treatment, right? And it's really beneficial in the long run. Survivors are safety planning all of the time, helping them tap into what they're already doing, what they have been doing, the way that they've managed to get through it so far is just a huge resource, right? And that, sometimes even if folks are able to leave a situation, they may still have to continue seeing that person. It may be somebody that they go to school with. It may be, somebody that they have to see at family gatherings. It may be that they have children in common. There can be lots of ways that they may still have to encounter that person. And so wanting to make sure that they can be as safe as possible in those situations as well. The goal really is just about increasing their choices, right? And sometimes it's like picking from a bunch of crappy choices, right? They may not be the choices that they wish that they had, but the more options there are, the better they're going to be able to cope and the better they're going to be able to create safety in their situation. So again, thinking about all the different things that may be impacting safety, right? You want to be thinking about confidentiality with you. You want to be thinking about your records and what they say, whether they may get pulled into court. You want to be thinking about parenting and custody issues, immigration. All of these things may be things that a person who is wanting to control their partner or be abusive to their partner may use in order to have or gain or maintain that control. Right? And they also are going to impact that survivor's ability to participate in treatment with you. So, there's really a lot of different factors to consider. And I would also encourage, we talked about safety planning with, around issues of suicide, right? Not just for the survivor, but for their partner as well. Also thinking about risks of community violence and any kind of safety related to issues of oppression that they may be experiencing, right? All of those kinds of experiences can exacerbate, compound, and worsen impacts of trauma, and can also present greater barriers to accessing safety and increasing safety. This is just a note again on kind of addressing that mental health coercion, right? We want to increase those supports. The more supports the survivor has, the better. So safety planning, getting down to, right? Short-term immediate safety planning. You can help somebody create a safety plan that is just to get away in the moment, right? Just to get away maybe for a night or a day or two. They don't have to leave to have a plan to create greater safety. Thinking about who they can call, who can be involved, right? Like who are the family members, the friends, the advocates, the sponsor, that, who are the people in their life that they can call on, that they could kind of have on standby, let them know, I might need to call in the middle of the night, who can they go stay with? Thinking about where they can go and whether, a lot of folks do have friends or family that they can go to, but if they don't, right? Can they afford a hotel or a motel? Can they sleep in their car and go, have awareness ahead of time of where they can park safely? Can they go to an all-night diner? Can they go to, we used to say the airport, but it's a lot harder. You can't really go inside as much anymore. Can they go be at a police station? Could they, can they use those locations too for times where there may be higher risk? Also thinking about safety in the home. The safest room in any house is a room with 2 exits, right? Being able to have multiple ways out. And thinking about avoiding places where there might be a lot of hard surfaces or enclosed spaces, or things that could potentially be used as weapons. And I know that's like, really getting down to details, but it's kind of just good to have some awareness about, different kinds of situations and what kind of greater safety you might be able to create and what you can anticipate. And then also just like having a bag packed ahead of time. And this can be tricky, right? Because you want to be careful about, that being noticeable. But if it's possible to kind of slowly make copies of important documents, or slowly move things, or store money in a safe location or with a safe person so that it's accessible when you need to go. But again, being mindful of what someone might notice and what might increase risk. This link on the bottom is for the National Domestic Violence Hotline. They have this fantastic interactive tool. You can go to the website and it will ask you questions point by point. One of the handouts included today is a handout that's sort of an example of what is asked in that interactive tool. The tool doesn't store data. You can offer an email and it will email that safety plan created by the tool, and it's available for 24 hours, and then all the data disappears. So that is an option that you can use with survivors. It's something that you could create if you wanted to, whether they decided they wanted a copy or it was safe to have a copy or not. That's an option to be able to make a concrete written safety plan. And it really goes through like all the different kinds of scenarios: home, work, kids, school, right? Like thinking about all the different pieces. It's a great tool. Thinking about events where risk might be higher, right? Court dates, anytime they're going to have to see that person, serving of paperwork, like when a restraining order is served, for example, visitation and exchanges, parenting time, anniversary dates and holidays, sometimes for whatever reason can be higher emotional times, higher tension, and there might be incidents around those times. Also anniversary dates of, of past events. When you're supporting somebody who has been through domestic violence or intimate partner violence, recognizing that they're going to have maybe a lot more intrusive thoughts or, painful memories of traumatic events around those times, and helping them take care of themselves during those times. Anytime that there's going to be contact, or if they, the person maybe from the past pops up again, anytime they have to, any kind of mandatory report or abuse report gets made or a police report gets made, anything where there might be retaliation, right? Wanting to safety plan around that. And really just any major life changes or anything that changes that level of power and control could be a time where you want to have just a little more safety planning. So access to lethal means. If there are guns in the house, that increases risk, right? And so if there's anybody in the relationship has thoughts of suicide or has expressed threats of suicide, that's for sure something to plan around. The Counseling on Access to Lethal Means training is a really good resource for this. But thinking about things like gun locks, gun safes, being able to hide or remove firearms, storing ammunition separately, being able to get firearms out of the home and maybe stored with someone else. Sometimes survivors are able to do this kind of secretly, but there's also, you've got to weigh that risk of retaliation if the partner behaving abusively discovers this. For in Oregon, there's an option to request firearms dispossession, meaning that when law enforcement serves the protective order, they can remove firearms. That's not true everywhere. Again, really checking the details of what is an option in the region that you're in. And also that if the survivor chooses to have a firearm for their own protection, making sure that you're kind of talking about the risk of that weapon being used against them, and that it, in general, there is still that risk of harm with that weapon present. Yeah. And again, I want to come back to strangulation, tremendous risk, tremendously high lethality indicator, right? And sometimes a person may seem fine after an incident of strangulation, but they may have significant damage, even risk of death. So medical care in those instances and a lot of safety planning is a really good idea. Long-term safety planning. So long-term goals are really about building independence, again, to increase the choices and the options that a survivor has, helping folks, have a bank account that's in their name only, being able to have some savings or keeping money with someone they trust. I worked with one survivor who would take the money maybe for rent and bills and put it in her shoe and walk around on it. And the sensory memory of that feeling of that money in her shoe helped build her confidence and strength in thinking about her plan to leave. And the money itself, of course, also helped provide that option. Building and repairing credit, sometimes that's something that happens in controlling relationships or abusive relationships where the person wanting to have control might destroy the other person's credit, right? So sometimes building that back to, again, increase options, thinking about eviction records, expungement so that they can gain employment, find housing, getting legal consultation, any kind of protective orders that may be available, exploring those options if they're safe, looking for housing. Housing is real tough. Again, it's the most needed and the hardest thing to find. And sometimes folks may have, not been in the job market for a long time too. So helping them kind of build options, volunteering, building up a resume, connecting them with resources to help with that, to be able to build that self-sufficiency. Reducing isolation, reducing their dependence on that partner or the partner's dependence on them, and increasing the help that's available so they have choices. Safety when leaving. So leaving is the most dangerous time, and right after leaving, right? Again, it's about power and control. And so leaving is a big shift in that, right? And the person who is wanting to have control may work hard to get it back. So really thinking about all the things that can be put in place ahead of time, plans A, plans B, plan C, right? Like sometimes you may have a plan. I've worked with folks where they had everything all lined up and then something happens. Maybe he was supposed to go on vacation and he didn't, or whatever it was, something was off and they had to not follow through with the plan at that time and come up with another plan. They may need to leave when that partner is out of the home, or away. That may mean that it's really, limited time to kind of do a lot really quickly. Some folks may want to kind of pack everything up immediately, or they might kind of slowly over time siphon their belongings and documents out of the home. And also just thinking about, your role as a mental health provider, helping folks have the coping strategies for containment and nervous system regulation, so that they may be having to lie to their partner, right? They may be having to appear very calm and like nothing's going on. And that can be really tough to do. This link here is a set of video interviews with folks who are survivors and also folks who have behaved abusively to a partner. It can be useful if you're looking to kind of see what that can look like, hear from folks directly about their own stories. The story of Nadine, she talks about having to kind of calm her heart rate and her breathing and be able to, tell her partner, everything's fine, I'll be here when you get home, right? When she was planning to leave. And then thinking about who can be present, like who can help. If law enforcement is serving a restraining order in the state of Oregon, they can be there, but it's like a 20-minute window. And whichever person is being required to leave the home has 20 minutes to gather their stuff and go. It's not a lot of time to get things that you need. Other times, if there's more time, you don't want that survivor to be alone when they're doing that, if at all possible. You want help, right? And I'm thinking about where they're going to go, and is it a confidential location? Sometimes folks might go to a family member's, but maybe that partner knows where that is. And so if it is a known location, then safety planning around that location. If they're able to go to a confidential location, thinking about ways to keep it confidential, right? And knowing that survivors may have to leave behind beloved pets and even potentially children. And that is a tremendously difficult decision to make, but sometimes it is the safest option. And kind of helping folks, weigh through those decisions about what they may be able to bring or not bring with them and how it's going to impact them. And again, so after leaving, again, the danger doesn't end. I've worked with so many folks where they're like, I'm going to get this divorce, or if I can get out, things are going to be fine. And the abusive behavior doesn't tend to end when the survivor leaves. So how do you keep a confidential location confidential? If you've got kids and maybe the kids are seeing the other parent also, talking with them about keeping it confidential, it's not easy to do. There is a program in Oregon called the Address Confidentiality Program that may be an option for some folks that helps keep that address off of records. Again, I don't know that that's an option in all states, and it's not an option in all situations. It requires a certain threshold of being able to demonstrate what's happening in the situation. A lot of domestic violence services organizations will have folks who are trained in that program. Getting cameras, changing locks, getting really creative with the resources you have. I've heard from folks about, hanging up like wind chimes that would, alert them if somebody, walked into them, so that putting up cameras in various places, making sure they can see things. I haven't even, string and tape over doors. I mean, there's a lot of ways that folks can get creative about what will help them feel safer. There is, again, in Oregon, a grant called Temporary Assistance for Domestic Violence Survivors for parents who have children in their custody, that offers a small amount of funds to be able to help do things like first to last and moving into a new place, or getting cameras or things like that too, to help increase safety. There's not a lot that may be available though to help with those things, and it can cost money to put those kinds of safety measures in place. Thinking about the technology, social media, right? Thinking about the ways that they can kind of limit the visibility of where they are, what's going on, any location tags, maybe turning off social media altogether, thinking about mutual friends and blocking folks, et cetera. This resource, Tech Safety, here is from the NNEDV. They have a whole array of information on ways to safety plan around technology. Super useful resource. Thinking about, how you get where you go, what that person knows about your routines and what you might want to change. You might need to go to a grocery store in a different area, right? You might need to change gyms, et cetera, talking with the school. about who can pick up kids, maybe notifying landlords, giving an image even of the person, so that if that person is coming onto the property, other folks are looking out, talking with neighbors, planning ahead for court processes, and just having a plan in general about when they encounter that person, right? For the survivor, just if they know what they want to do and you talk with them ahead of time, do you want to leave immediately? Do you want to go, if there's a protective order, do you want to go notify someone in charge that that person needs to leave? What is your plan? What do you want to do? Who are you going to call? Where do you want to go? Knowing all of that ahead of time before it happens, because it'll happen eventually, right? Can really help somebody feel prepared and be able to act on that plan when the time comes. And also just remembering, folks may want to have no contact, but sometimes they want to maintain some contact, and that can actually be safer in a lot of situations. We find that for a lot of folks, they may get a new number and give it out to everyone, but they keep the old one. We hear from folks that if that ex-partner has some way of contacting them, they still feel like they have some control, right? Versus if they have no contact, they may kind of up the ante to try to get that control back or try to find them or get contact. So really trusting that survivor's gut about what's going to be safest for them. And then, also recognizing that they may go back, right? And that you want to be there to support them regardless, whether they are staying in the relationship, leaving, going back, maybe leaving again, right? No shame. We just want to help them be safer in whatever situation they're in. Oops. Yes. And then thinking about, oh wait, there's some questions here. Okay. Thinking about situations survivor can be one. I don't know about that, about being penalized for calling 911 too many times. I would say that's an issue of training with law enforcement. I was actually had the wonderful opportunity yesterday to talk with our county sheriff. So folks, law enforcement get lots of training, and I would say that one of the important pieces about trauma-informed training is that that we recognize and we understand about domestic violence and interpersonal violence, that it's not a black and white thing. It's not, it's happening and then it's not happening, right? And that there are going to be folks need ongoing support, and folks in domestic violence services organizations can help advocate, can help support survivors if they're experiencing interactions with systems where the systems become impatient or punitive around the ways that they're trying to safety plan. I know that's not a super clear answer, but yeah, I can advocate also maybe with landlords. And think about, sometimes calling 911 isn't the best option. Sometimes involving law enforcement isn't safe for everyone, right? So coming up with alternative options of who can be called and what you can do in a situation is really important. Okay. So just briefly now, safety planning with kids. There's a whole lot of handouts on this because I'm not going to talk about this for too long. We like to talk with kids about, on their fingers, 5 safe people and 5 safe places that they can memorize, that they can think about. You can talk with kids, or parents can talk with kids about hiding places in the home and when to hide. Talking with them about staying out of fights and arguments because they can get hurt, right? Kids often will try to protect, they'll want to intervene, and it's really risky for them. And so really talking with them about staying out of it, letting the grown-ups handle it, and that they need to stay safe, right? And teaching them to call 911 and when to call. A lot of times parents will come up with like a code word or a signal to let kids know, it can be anything at all. It can be something that, is like, closing the blinds and turning on the porch light. It can be, boy, you sure need a haircut. Last time you had a haircut was when we got hamburgers. I mean, it can be any phrase or word at all to kind of let kids know when it's time to use the safety plan. But just like for adults, practicing safety plans can be really useful too, because the more we practice, it becomes automatic, right? We're not having to kind of think of it or try to recall in a moment where we're feeling that fight, flight, freeze response. And again, for kids, thinking about providing the school with any copies of protective orders and being really clear about, who's able to pick kids up or access them at school. And I also just want to say that, we know that exposure to domestic violence can have negative impacts on kids, but that research consistently shows that attachment to a non-abusive primary caregiver is just the most important, most protective thing. So being able to keep families together as much as possible, keep kids in the home, in a safe home, right, is the ideal thing. And then a whole bunch of resources for you here, that national hotline, the OCADSVA, they have a map where you can kind of find your local domestic violence services organization. And again, that National Center for Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health, it is your friend. It has so much good info. Futures Without Violence, that info on trauma-informed reporting. Love is Respect is a great one for teen dating violence. And a few others on trauma. This is the Technology National Network to End Domestic Violence technology resources. And that last one is the resources for suicide prevention training. And there's my contact info, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Thanks, Jennifer. A few things I want to add. Hi, folks. I'll introduce myself more formally here in just a minute when I get my slideshow going. But I'm going to be talking about working with abusive partners, couples, and also if you see them individually. But before we shift, just a few things I wanted to add and highlight. Some of these things you actually said, but I just want to underscore them because I think they're so important. One is the research around victim concern or survivor concern. Survivors are actually have been shown to be actually pretty accurate in voicing their concern, especially for voicing concern rather than safety. So they're not as accurate in saying, hey, I'm safe, things are going to be fine. But they're especially good at saying, I am very, very worried right now. I am very, very worried. So it's very important that if you are working with a survivor, an abused partner, and they're expressing serious concern, you take it seriously. So I think I just want to underscore that. I know you said that. I just want to, another thing I think is the risk factors for lethal violence are different than the risk factors for escalated violence. And again, I think if you look at Jennifer's slides, she kind of makes that distinction. For lethal violence, as someone who tracks in the media in Oregon, domestic homicides, what I see over and over and over again are the biggest ones. One is that almost always lethal violence is either as the target is preparing to leave or has left. So if they are in the midst of either getting ready to leave or they've actually left, the risk is at the highest. We know this. Also, Jennifer mentioned suicidality. I think that's especially a concern if the abusive partner feels like they have nothing to live for. That is a huge concern. Another thing about firearms is the research has shown that just the presence of firearms increases lethal risk, even when the actual means of committing the murder was not using a firearm. So there's just the presence, and it has to do, I think, with the mentality of people who are willing to own firearms increases that risk. And then also, I think a significant major life change, such as loss of a job or significant change in health condition, these are a couple other triggers for potentially lethal risk. And then, of course, lots of things contribute to escalated abusive behavior, which is a much more common thing. So we're worried about lethal risk. That's very, very unusual, thankfully. But what's much, much more common is the way that abusive behavior will ebb and flow. And its exact flow is very different from relationship to relationship. But again, the abused partner is going to know it very well. They can tell you exactly, some can be incredibly predictably patterned. Others are incredibly predictably unreliable, but they can tell you what the pattern is. They know very well. So a lot of risk planning is really is around safety planning is really around what is the abusive partner's pattern? Typically, what does it look like? when do they most typically escalate, and how do you effectively navigate those times? And another thing I think is that near the end, Jennifer was talking a lot about risk around leaving and after you've left, which we know is the most serious and dangerous time. You may be working with survivors who have no intent of leaving. And so there's still needs to be ongoing safety planning, but it's much more around how to navigate the flow of the abuse. In my experience, I've worked with directly with dozens and dozens of survivors over the years, and that changes things. Are they going to be in the relationship for good? Are they going to be in a relationship for 3 more years until a certain event happens? Are they going to be in a relationship for 3 more months? And that's how do they most effectively navigate that to limit as much as possible the abuse to themselves and their children. So these are just a few other things I wanted to emphasize, that all which Jennifer covered. And so really safety planning is about how to get safe immediately, but it's also just how to reduce the impact of the abuse, how to limit their exposure. I also want to make it explicit that we are in no way implying that the abused partner is in any way responsible for the abusive behavior. They have 0% responsibility for the abusive behavior. But what they can do is given that, they can still find ways to do their best to navigate it. It's like we're not responsible for the weather, but we are responsible for how we deal with the weather. And that's kind of the idea. And helping them troubleshoot, providing them with support, and so forth and so on. So, are there any other questions? And of course, you can ask them throughout. Before I shift into my material, are there any other questions for Jennifer related to working with abused partners and safety planning with abused partners that folks have as we segue?
There was one question in the chat, situation where they do not have access to a phone. I know that's a very specific question, but it was in the chat. Yeah.
That's a great question. Sometimes domestic violence services organizations can provide phones. There's some wireless carriers that also will offer reduced rates for survivors. But I would say, is there a neighbor? Where can they go? Just having a plan physically of where to go. And trying to get access to a phone. A phone often gets targeted in incidents of abuse, right? Because it's a lifeline, it's a line to help. And so phones often will get broken, taken, and it can be worth even having a backup, a burner phone, a track phone, whatever. Yeah, phones are important, and it's super tough when a person doesn't have one. I know for a lot of the rural survivors that I work with, that cell service even can be spotty, right? And neighbors are really far away. So those are for sure some unique situations where you want to get creative about where you can go, what you can do, and how you can get to a way to call or access help.
And I think another point I'd make about with children, I really want to highlight, I think it was the next to last slide Jennifer shared, which is something that I talk regularly with abused partners who are parents about, is that I think the most important, in my opinion, the most important thing you can do to support your children is to be, when there's an abusive parent, is to be consistently open to hearing what they have to say, making it very clear to them, you are always welcome to tell me whatever happened, whatever you want to about the other parent, your experience with them. It's not like you're tattling. I will just listen. I will listen without judgment. And so keeping that line of communication as open as possible, including helping them understand why does the other parent act the way they do. The older the child is, the more you can kind of explain this to them and help them understand. This isn't about vilifying the other parent or turning them into a monster. It's simply helping the child or the children understand how the other parent thinks differently in ways that don't make sense to them. It's similar to having a parent who's an active alcoholic. If you can understand what it means to be an alcoholic, it can help you not personalize things that are going on and things of that nature. I also think that the older the children are, in general, the safer they're going to be in terms of they can do more for their own safety. They can do more to voice what concerns are. They can do more to set boundaries. The boundaries they set are more likely to be listened to by the outside system. The younger the children are, in my experience, the more vulnerable they are. They may not be able to articulate as well. They may be more completely intimidated by the abusive parent and so forth and so on. So how you work with the child or the children really varies depending on their age.
I see
So I
the
think
comment too about, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Jennifer.
About specifically when the other parent takes the child's phone away, that certainly does happen a lot, or turns it off and doesn't give the child access to contact the other parent. And I would say seek legal advice, right? And I recognize that's also an incredibly limited resource, but sometimes it can be written into parenting plans, custody agreements, that the kid has a right to call and to contact. And if it's not happening, documenting it. And it may mean going back to court repeatedly, which again is, kind of weighing the options about what's going to feel safest or best to do. But yeah, for sure, that's something that happens a lot.
All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get going with my presentation. And of course, keep the questions and comments coming. So I'm going to be my part that I'm going to be talking about now is working with the abusive partner, given that that's a lot of what I do. Just a second here, I have to get my show organized here. Okay, so just very briefly, for those of you who haven't met me from previous webinars in this series, I'm Chris Huffine. I'm a psychologist, licensed psychologist, and executive director of Allies in Change. I've been doing this work in domestic violence field for 30 years, mainly working with abusive partners. But I've also worked a good amount with abused partners directly in individual work, some as part of a couple, and then the agencies that I've been a part of have also offered group services for them as well. So I could go on, but that's enough. Just briefly, been doing this work a long time. And then Allies in Change is a 501c3 private nonprofit. We present as an adult counseling agency, which we are. And we offer individual and couples work. And I myself, as a psychologist, have done individual therapy and couples therapy for lots of issues not related to domestic violence over the years, as well as, of course, issues related to abusive behavior. We offer almost 30 groups a week for abusive partners. We offer one group for women who've been abused, so one group for survivors. We also work with a fair number of voluntary abusive partners who are not court involved. So that's a little about the agency. And then I'll mention the book. I'll be referring to this a little bit later as well. That's come out about 6 months ago, actually a little bit longer than that now, called Becoming Allies, which is written for abusive partners in terms of helping them change and work on themselves. Ideally, it should be done in conjunction with getting involved with the specialized group, with abuse intervention groups for abusive partners, but it is a way of kind of getting them going. Some abused partners have also read this book and given feedback, and they find it very validating, even though they're not the target audience. So that's a little bit about my background. I don't know if Jennifer said this or not in her presentation. She may have at the beginning. I want to further underscore this as well. This training is not how to do, highly skilled, precise, specialized safety planning. This is really basic safety planning is what we're covering today. This is not a substitute for referring your client to survivor services, for example, such as the agencies Jennifer's a part of. They're going to be much better trained and much more knowledgeable in local resources and the nuances and all this. So the idea here is what's best of all, if you have a client who's involved with domestic violence, that they get specialized services. If they are being abused through survivor services, sometimes they're called shelters or DV shelters, but almost always the shelter offers additional things besides shelter. They can offer individual counseling, they may offer support groups, they can offer other resources. So they're more than just a resource for people who are abused, who are trying to flee the relationship. So it's very important you understand that. And then for abusive partners, there are mental health professionals with some specialty, but ideally they should be going into an abuse intervention group. So a little bit about that. So I'm going to talk some about couples. And of course, as I've talked in a couple of the prior webinars, couples counseling is not an appropriate intervention for domestic violence. However, sometimes the only way that people will engage in services is as a couple. Sometimes the only reason why they're willing to continue is as a couple. So this is kind of the situation where it's not ideal, but it's what's happening in the real world. Um, and you know, I also talked about how to work with a couple as a couple in the last webinar. So I'm not going to repeat any of that information either. Go, you can view that one. Instead, I'm talking about so you are seeing a couple. There is domestic violence present. You're aware of that. For whatever reason, you're choosing to continue working with them. What do you do then? And these are thoughts and ideas, and it's not like we have a well-established consensus among professionals about what exactly to do around safety planning, especially on the abusive partner side. So most of what I'm going to be saying are my thoughts and ideas. You all are welcome to ask questions or push back. Jennifer, as well, you're welcome. If you have alternative perspectives or ideas, you're welcome to share them as well. And again, my goal with safety planning and what I'm talking about here is really how to do harm reduction. It's really about the abusive behavior is going to continue. So the idea here is not how can we stop there being abuse. That's just not realistic. The way you stop abusive behavior is the person who's being abusive makes significant internal changes to their belief system and their lifestyle. That's what my group, the groups at abuse intervention programs hopefully will do ideally. You're not going to do this. So this is not about stopping all abuse. This is about doing what you can to help reduce the abusive behavior, to reduce the severity, the frequency, the extensiveness of it, how to mitigate it. That's really what we're looking at doing here, okay? The abuse will continue. Inevitably, it's going to continue. It's the nature of it. It's going to continue. But what can we do to help mitigate it, okay? So try to avoid high conflict areas. And this seems somewhat contradictory because the nature of couples work is to typically focus on high conflict areas. That's why they're coming in, is the most difficult arguments. Those, of course, are also the things that are most likely to lead to the most escalated abusive behavior. So it's being careful about that. If you bring up the high ticket items, it very well may trigger further escalation, okay? Another thing is to keep the abusive behavior on your radar, all right? One of the things that is easy to do with individuals as well as with couples is you get locked into thinking as a therapist, and because they don't want to do the violence work, you talk about everything else they want to talk about. And it's important that you not forget there's this thing going on. And it would be similar if somebody had an active addiction and they wanted individual counseling on depression to help with their active addiction. They may need help with their depression. That is not necessarily going to stop their active addiction. But if the only way they'll engage in services is by seeing you for depression, okay, you'll see them, but you want to keep an eye on that thing, okay, even if it's not the main focus. So one way of doing that is, how are things going? Has there been any significant abusive behavior since the last time we met? Any major concerns in that area? So again, it doesn't have to take a lot of time, necessarily if they don't want to tend to it a lot, but you need to keep it on your radar, okay? So one way, of course, you can do this is you can do this by directly and explicitly inquiring. But the other thing you can do is to kind of note it covertly. And I speak from my direct experience doing this work sometimes, is it's not something they want to attend to. It's not something they want to talk about a lot, but I can still keep an eye on it. And partly what I'm doing is I'm listening for little details that indicate that there was more abusive behavior, So where would you all like to focus today? Oh, we had a pretty bad argument. And again, let's say this is a couple that really doesn't want to talk about abuse. They want to help with their conflicts. And so, yeah, so go ahead. So what happened in the argument? And then as they're talking about it, and they don't want to focus more on the content, what I'm noticing, or I can pick up, is it sounds like he was yelling at her. He was calling her some names. It sounds like she was not intimidated by him, although she was quite hurt by what he said. So these are things I figured out just by listening to what's going on. So the idea is that you're tracking this stuff, even if you aren't doing it explicitly. You're keeping tabs on this. How much is this continuing to play? What my experience is that if I keep tabs on it, it'll become clear to me how it's either getting worse or it's getting better, how it's getting more severe or it's becoming less of an area of concern. And the general idea is the more a concern is becoming, the more you want to attend to it. So you need to keep an eye on all this, basically. Right at the beginning of working with a couple where you notice domestic violence, you want to set some kind of a boundary around having a zero tolerance for abuse. John Gottman, and who I have a lot of respect for, I have one major disagreement with, but a lot of respect. I've had training, from talks about one of the things that he will not see couples is that they have physical violence present. So as I understand it, now this training was from a long time ago. I'm assuming this hasn't changed, his stance, but his stance used to be there are only two circumstances where he would refuse to meet with couples. One was that there was active physical violence going on, and the second was that there was an active affair happening that the other person wasn't aware of. Those were the two conditions. Anything else was fine. And basically what that meant, and this is where we get into a bit of a disagreement, is that he's willing to see couples with verbal abuse, with psychological abuse, with financial abuse, as long as there isn't physical abuse. So that's kind of where he has put his line, if you will. And I think that's up to you as a couples therapist, where you would set that line. But the idea is, okay, can we all agree there'll be no physical abuse? Can we all agree that there won't be this or there won't be that? The idea is not to agree to have no abusive behavior at all. If it has a pattern of abuse, that's an unrealistic boundary, and then it's just going to get violated all the time. But it's really about, can we limit what's happening? And I'll talk more about limiting the abuse when I talk about working with the abusive partner here in the individual work. And then once the couple makes that agreement on what that boundary is going to be, let's say no physical abuse, just note when that boundary is violated, note when that's not happening, when that's not being respected. And that's just a way of planting seeds around, we need more than couples work. We need more than couples work. This alone is not going to do it, right? Jennifer talked about a variety of safety planning tips in her presentation. Most of that still applies when you're working with a couple in terms of things that are relevant and that you can focus on, okay? And then as the abuse escalates, voice concerns, if it gets to a certain point, you might ultimately say, I can't continue meeting with you as a couple. I would encourage caution at setting a hard boundary like that, especially if there are no other resources. So I think it's important to be mindful of the abused person in particular. Do they have other supports? Do they have other avenues? If they do, great. But if they don't, if this is the one and only place where they get any acknowledgement or validation, I would say just be much more hesitant to just say, I'm not going to meet with you anymore. Because that may be it, then there's nothing. And so part of it would be, can I at least get the abused partner linked up with additional resources? And I'll talk about that more in a moment. Now, let's say that you're actually doing a session. It's very rare that there's abusive behavior done directly in front of the couples therapist. Occasionally that happens. It's rare though. But part of that is there agitation going on in the session? Again, it's typical that couples work is going to escalate intensity. Couples work is going to escalate conflict. It's kind of the nature of the service, if you will. So pay attention to that and make sure that before they leave your office. So what's the plan for when you two leave? For example, a common thing you might recommend or even require is that they come in separate vehicles, if they own two vehicles. Okay, even if they're living together, that they're not going to drive home together. That's, for example, one concrete thing that can make a difference. In particular, again, you want to focus on the person who's the abusive partner and talk with them very directly. So I understand, Roy, was a hard session for you. I can see you're quite upset. Oh, you're telling me. I sure am. Boy, she completely blindsided me with this stuff. This is just such bullshit. Yeah, I got that, Roy. Hey, would you be willing to hang out for a few minutes? So you and I can talk a little bit more. I think you could use some more support. So especially when you're working with a couple, as much as you can, working with the person who's being abusive or who will be abusive, to see if you can help them more. And that, when I talk about how to work with abusive partners individually here in a few minutes, a lot of that you could do with a couple as well. Where what you're going to do is ask if the abusive partner, especially if they're agitated in that session that day, if they can hang out a little bit longer, just so you can do some of that safety planning with them. And you can present it as support. I can see that this hasn't gone well. I totally get why you're frustrated. Let's talk some more about how you can handle this so it doesn't cause additional difficulties. So it's really about joining with the abusive partner and then working with them right then. So that's if in the moment you see that or if you suspect that. All right. Another thing, even some couples therapists in their typical orientation to couples work We'll occasionally meet with one half of the couple individually. I also want to just note on the side that we do have more polyamorous relationships where it actually may not be two people, there may be actually more than two people. And so there's actually, when we talk about a couple, it's not two people, it may be three people, for example. And of course, you have to make further adjustments to all this. But I just want to acknowledge that this is still work that you can do even when there are more than two people in the relationship, which does occasionally happen with folks who are polyamorous, for example. But where I was going with this is even if you don't routinely see individuals as part of the couple, in other words, I only see a couple as a couple. I generally do not see one half of the couple anytime. While I'm doing couples work, it's always just with the two people. If that's your general stance, which is common, consider making exceptions for that when you're working with a couple that has domestic violence present, if you're going to continue working with them. Consider the possibility of being willing to occasionally meet with one or the other individually, in part and mainly just to further address the concerns around the abusive behavior. Okay. I think it's especially important to meet with the abused partner alone, to talk with them about your continuing concerns, to talk with them a little bit about safety planning, including some of the safety planning that Jennifer already talked about, including hooking up with additional resources. So, and again, the more you're their only resource, the more invested they are in the couple's work, the more important it is that you do this. You know, of course, you can't overstep what you feel comfortable doing, but do what you can to provide the support and to try to create, you know, connect that person with resources. Okay. So those are a few other things with couples. So this is, again, very brief safety planning, and I'm happy to answer more questions about that. But now I'm going to segue to working with abusive partners alone. Okay. So, and this is a newer concept. So safety planning, the concept of safety planning has been around as long as there have been folks working with abused partners. That's one thing they had to figure out is, what do we do? In more recent years, there's kind of a variation of safety planning that's actually being used with abusive partners. So this is a much more recent development and idea, and even using this phrase, and it has a different meaning. Because what we're talking about when we're talking about abusive partners is it's not about how they can stay safe, it's about how they can be safe or how they can be safer. So the idea with this kind of safety planning is, again, for the long-term work, you know, is for you to stop your abuse and control altogether. And you do that by going into specialized group work. But in the meantime, what can we do with you to help right now, before all that's set, help you not be abusive or be as abusive? Okay. And this is analogous, and I'm going to keep referring back to this analogy, is if somebody has an active addiction, the goal is to support them getting clean and sober, to help them get into recovery and to practice a clean and sober lifestyle. That's much more extensive work. And something they practice for the rest of their lives. But you know, before that, what you might be trying to do with them is just how to not drink today or not to use this week. So that's not really so much about sobriety, which is kind of a longer term process. It's about how can we just reduce risk right now for you drinking this week. And that's kind of what I'm talking about here. What safety planning is what can we do in the short run, in the short term, to limit and reduce the abusive behavior that you're doing. Okay. This is especially important if a person's not involved with a specialized abuse intervention program. If they're in that program, that's where all that work should be happening. So if you're seeing somebody individually who's also in an abuse intervention program, you should probably not be stepping into a lot of the abusive behavior with them. That's now in the domain of the program working with them in the group. You can then are much freer to work on the individual stuff that you have, you know, as a therapist. And then, of course, another part of this in safety planning is getting them ready to get involved with the group, encouraging to consider that possibility, and so forth and so on. Okay. And another thing that's implicit in what I'm talking about here with safety planning is that on some level, the person you're working with wants to not be abusive, that there's some desire to stop their abuse. That is not always the case. So the more evident they feel fine being abusive, the more evident they don't want to stop it, they don't intend to stop it, they're not going to stop it, then safety plan is going to be, obviously a waste of time. So it's really about, hopefully, they already don't want to be abusive, or that part of the work is helping them understand why they shouldn't want to be abusive and why that would be a better choice for themselves as well. So individually, I think it's important to, again, just like with the couples, you have got to keep an eye on their abusive behavior. They will often put it in the background and try to put it off screen. And you can directly, explicitly ask them, was there any abusive behavior this week since we last met? Has there been any abusive episodes? Have you lost your temper since we last met? However you want to ask it. But just like with the couple, if they don't really want to talk on that level, you can just keep an eye on it in a covert way. In my experience, if you can listen closely between the lines, you can sense when there's been abusive behavior. In fact, they may kind of disclose it in the process of talking about other things. Okay. And I think in talking about this stuff, don't collude with them in saying the abuse doesn't matter, or in having them minimize it. Point out, this is a problem for you. Not always a problem for your partner, it's a problem for you. A common way that I talk about abusive behavior is, I could be making the most legitimate point to you in the world, but if I'm calling you names and yelling at you, all you're going to notice is I'm calling you names and yelling at you. Your legitimate point is going to get lost. So that, anger issues, losing your temper, right, becoming abusive is like a smokescreen. It obscures other things, including the very legitimate points you wanted to make. I find that a lot of abusive people get that. They can say, you're right, I shouldn't have yelled. Yelling, she just got very upset with me then. And, it would be much better if I hadn't. Yeah, especially because you were so concerned about this thing, right? Totally. Okay. You can also kind of, and I'll talk about this a little bit later in the presentation, but you can also kind of tag, if there are situations coming up that could be high risk of abusive behavior, is to troubleshoot them in advance. This may require you again to take that initiative because your client may not. Okay. And then I want to talk about some concrete tools, 5 concrete tools that you can work with abusive partners to stay not abusive. Now, again, this is not a substitute for abuse intervention. Okay. Just like if I talk with you about how not to drink this week, that's not a substitute for substance abuse intervention. This is the same idea, but these are things that can help potentially reduce the intensity or the frequency of their abusive behavior. Yeah, go ahead, Jane.
The question is for the previous slide. Audra Lee asks, my internet's unstable, sorry. Audra asks, is it important to document in progress notes the covert observations, monitoring of abusive behaviors you are tracking, or just to mentally track these?
Yeah, that's a good question. It really depends on how you view your notes and how you feel about the notes that you're taking. So clinicians vary greatly around, who they're taking their notes for, who they anticipate seeing them, how much information they present. So I don't think there's one right answer to that. I think if you're somebody who tends to want to record lots of information in your notes, then you could certainly record that in your notes. On the other hand, if you're somebody who tends to be pretty brief with your notes, you don't have to include this. So I don't think it's necessary to chart it. You can, but I don't think it's necessary. It's really up to you. What's more important is that you're keeping it in your mental treatment plan, in your mental screening, is kind of what we're looking for. Okay. So 5 tools I'm going to cover, and these are Band-Aids. I'm giving you all Band-Aids to put on your clients, not ways to help them heal and recover and change. Okay. So first Band-Aid are interruption and response delay techniques. So research has found that one of the most common ways that abusive partners stop their abuse in the moment, is through interruption and response delay. This is very concrete. It's very simple, and it can work. And people who are not wanting to be abusive in the moment report this is what they will do. Okay. And what they all have in common, and I'll list a few of them, is they all about very quickly disengaging from the situation, very quickly stopping it. Okay. either before they're abusive or as they're actually being abusive. So this applies not only to preventing abuse, but interrupting abuse. Okay, these are again short-term solutions. And I have a whole chapter in my book, Becoming Allies. Chapter 14 in my book is just on this, and it's positioned where it is right in the center of the book, because the arc of the book is the first half is really about all the different ways people are abusive and controlling, the beliefs, the denial, the impact, and then and that it's about them taking responsibility, and you can behave differently. This is how you can behave differently. And then the second half of the book is all about ways to behave differently. Well, the beginning of how to behave differently, when you don't know how to do anything else, is just stop it. So that's why it's kind of the center chapter. There are about 28 chapters in the book, 29 chapters. It's a big book. So that's why it's in the center, because it's an early technique. What I found is that abusive partners don't do this a lot later in their work. Later in their work, they don't need to use this kind of a Band-Aid. Early in their work, this is when they have to do this a lot. Okay. So here I'm going to go over five of these things. So again, I've got a little bit of an outline here. I'm going to cover 5 tools, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then A through E are specific interruption techniques. Thinking and delaying before responding, interrupting an abusive response, walking away, taking a time out, and shelving or delaying the exchange. So I'm going to explain each one. And I will zip along here. So thinking before responding is very simple and very concrete. People get this all the time, is you just pause. Just pause. Count to 10 before you speak. Count to 5. Kind of like, please engage, please, engage brain before putting mouth in motion, kind of idea, right? Take a breath, right? Pause before you hit that send button on your phone or on your computer, right? So just delaying slightly. If it's a good idea now, it'll still be a good idea in 2 minutes. It'll still be a good idea in an hour, okay? And this can include zipping your lips. Just close your mouth, just zip it, right? And so here we got our GIF, right? You can sing along here, right? When a problem comes along, you must zip it, right? And humor, I think, is a fine way, especially with abusive partners, to kind of get through some of their defensiveness, is to, join with them around that, okay? So the idea here is that, while it's a choice, it's a very quick, instant choice to be abusive and controlling. It can be. That's to interrupt that, to just create a little bit of space. Then you go, you know what, I want to, I shouldn't say that, right? So just a little bit of a room, just a little bit of a pause so they can make a different choice. Just a little bit of, that's the idea. This also works especially well for people who get dysregulated, who are very impulsive. It's really about how to teach just a little bit, a tiny bit of practical impulse control in a Band-Aid kind of way, okay? That slight delay. Honestly, I think most of us do this. I know there've been times when I will write an email, say, you know what, I should wait a minute before sending it. So I pause, especially if I'm agitated, and then I look it over. No, let me remove this, let me remove that. And then of course, the email I ultimately send is much more thoughtful and respectful than if I just send, right? All right. Second thing you can do, again, a Band-Aid, which is, again, is very common. I see this being done all the time, especially early on in their work, is they start becoming abusive. So they aren't able to prevent the abuse. They start yelling, they start calling names, they start getting physically agitated, whatever. They start to walk towards the person, whatever it is that they do, they actually become abusive, but then they stop it. In the moment, they stop it. And the idea here is, as quick as you can, stop the abuse. This is an early thing that I see happening. So an abusive partner will come in the group that week and say, I was verbally abusive this week. I yelled at my partner. The part that was better is that normally, I mean, we could have an argument where I'm yelling at her for an hour. And this was about 3 minutes, So I was verbally abusive and was acknowledged, and I was able to disengage after 3 minutes, okay? Again, it's safer. It's not ideal. There was still abuse there, but not as much. So the idea is as quick as they can, when they kind of cross that line, to step away, to step back, to stop it, to not even do more. Okay. And one more GIF related to that. Now would be a real good time for you to stop talking, right? If you're getting verbally abusive, stop talking. If you're getting verbally abusive, stop it, step away. Okay. Very concrete. Third tool, again, early one, very simple to use, very easy to understand, is to walk away. Walk away. You know, you can even hear, you even see this in situations where people are getting, often men are getting escalated even with each other. Just walk away, man. Just walk away. The same idea here. And the idea is to disengage rather than engage and either become abusive or become more abusive, is to disengage. This is, again, a very crude and basic interaction. Also, walking away itself can be problematic. It can be stonewalling. It's a way of silencing their partner. So again, it's not, you know, the ideal tool to use for the rest of your life. But for somebody who's at the beginning of their change work, who we're just trying to limit their abusive behavior, reduce it, walking away is a fine thing as an early intervention. Also, walking away is not the same thing as a timeout. Walking away is much simpler and cruder. You just physically leave. That's all you're doing. You're not doing anything else. Okay. Concrete, simple. They understand that. Okay. The more elegant and sophisticated tool, when it's used appropriately, are timeouts. And this one's still animated. You're getting two other handouts from me today. The first is a handout on timeouts. So that explains it in much more detail, what a timeout is. It's basically when all else fails, you take a timeout. It's like an emergency brake. The way emergency brake is in the car, right? Or on a train, if the regular brakes fail, you pull the emergency brake. That's what like a timeout is, okay? Ideally, you take a timeout before you become abusive, ideally, is what you're looking for, all right? Timeouts, everyone's heard the phrase timeout, and because it's such a well-known phrase, it's often misunderstood and misapplied. That's why I'm very clear and very concrete about the steps in a timeout. And I'm not going to go through this in as much detail as I would with an individual in the interest of time. But very briefly, the idea is you take a timeout, not when you're getting angry, but when you're, or if you're getting intense, it's when the intensity is getting away from you. So if I feel like I'm managing myself pretty well, even though I'm pretty upset by what you're saying, I don't need to take a timeout. A timeout is when my intensity, my anger, my management of myself is starting to get away from me, okay? That's when you ideally would take a timeout. And the steps in the timeout are very clear. Number one, you have to announce it, especially if it's a timeout with somebody you're close to, like your partner. You need to let them know what you're doing, okay? Which is, I'm taking a timeout, okay? Timeouts can be of varying lengths. Give your partner an idea of about how long you're gonna be gone. I'll be back in a few minutes. I'll be back in an hour. I'll be back in 20 minutes, okay? And then if at all possible, you physically leave. Very important. One of the mistakes that I've observed over the years is people who don't leave, when they can get hooked back into the situation before they're ready, which can lead to abusive behavior. And then while they're gone, while they're away from the situation, they're doing three main things. Number one, they're calming themselves down physically. They can do that through exercise, through breathing, through relaxation. They need to calm themselves down physically. Deal with the adrenaline that's flowing through their body. It's got them agitated probably. The second thing they need to do is change their attitude, okay? Improve their self-talk is what we call it. You know, chances are they're quite having a lot of negative thinking, a lot of justifying thinking, a lot of vilifying that's going on potentially. You gotta stop all that. That's the devil on your shoulder. You gotta connect with that angel on your shoulder, right? And then they need to make a more thoughtful plan. How can I deal with this situation more effectively? How can I deal with this situation in a way that doesn't involve me getting abusive? What can I say? What can I do? In the moment when it's happening, it may be hard to come up with alternative ways of behaving. Whereas on a timeout, you know, with that pause, with the situation frozen, now they can actually take the time to be more thoughtful about it. And then having done just those three things, they need to return to the situation. Very important. The most common way that abusive partners misuse timeouts, the ways they weaponize timeouts, is they use it as a way of avoiding issues. If my partner brings up something I don't want to deal with, I just say timeout and I walk away. They bring it up again. I say timeout again. I walk away. I never follow up. So with a timeout, a true timeout, you have got to return to the situation. Okay. If you don't, it's not a timeout. All right. Things that are not a timeout include having something to eat. Okay. You may realize that part of what's going on is you're hungry. That's probably why you're not doing well. You should still probably talk with your partner or the other person first before you all go off and have a meal. I guess you could maybe grab something real quick, a snack, but really the idea is to re-engage. You've interrupted the situation. You want to re-engage. Sleeping is not a timeout. Again, you may realize that you're very tired. You may need to take a nap. Fine, but not a timeout. That's not the same thing. Watching television, playing on your phone, cruising the internet. None of these things are part of timeouts. All right. Practice timeouts are when you're not upset, when you're not escalated, but you're practicing it. It's like a trial run. It's important if you can, to practice it so that you'll know to do it or think to do it when you're really upset. It's also important that you do this in the presence of your partner so that they get used to what a timeout looks like when it's not a real one. So when you take one for real, they'll know what's going on. Okay. So a lot more I could say about timeouts. Like I said, there's a full long page handout. There's more information in my book. There are other questions about timeouts. I'm happy to answer them. But that's kind of the quick version of timeouts. And then the fifth interruption technique is to shelve the situation. And shelving is something we all do at times. To shelve something means that I'm going to temporarily stop talking about it. I'm temporarily going to put it on the shelf, so to speak, and I'll take it off later on. I think most people do this at times, in relationship, because you're too tired. There's not enough time to talk about this. You don't have the energy. There are other things you need to be focusing on. So this is a very normal behavior for everybody. But this is also a way for somebody who's dealing with abusive behavior. Again, if they're getting agitated, maybe just wait, delay having the exchange. This is not a timeout because you're not in the middle of the situation. You're realizing, you know what, even though this is really bothering me, I should probably not bring this up tonight. Okay. Most abusive partners, if they're being honest, can shelve things. Okay. Because the thing that most abusive partners do shelve is their abusive behavior. And what I mean by this is it's rare that abusive partners are abusive in public. Okay. So even if something happens in public that upsets them, let's say their partner does something they don't agree with or don't approve of, or something of that nature, they will wait until they are in private before they will become abusive then. So my partner may say something to embarrass me. I'm not going to yell at her right then. I'm going to wait. I'm going to shelve my yelling until we're in the car on the way home, or even better yet, till we get home. Or actually, where we're going to do this is once we're in the driveway of the house, before we go inside where the babysitter is, but after we're away from the other guests, is when I'm going to let her have it. So again, abusive partners often are very easily able to shelve their abuse. That is, they temporarily stop their abuse and they become abusive when it's at a better time. This is the pro-social alternative, which is shelve the conflict temporarily. Okay. All right. Second safety planning technique with abusive partners is encourage them to limit the contact they're having with the abused partner. Okay. The more frequent their abuse, the more important this is. If their abusive behavior is more episodic, if there's a pattern to it, then the idea would be when they're at their greater risk, they would limit contact. I'll get back to intoxication in a minute, but that might be one example. Is that any night either of you's been drinking, you're not gonna be in the same bedroom together that night, for example. So the idea is the less contact there is, the fewer opportunities there are to be abusive. So this is a surface intervention. Doesn't really change what's going on underneath, but it creates fewer opportunities. And this could include sleeping in separate rooms, either on an ongoing basis or as needed. This could include shifting their work schedules or social schedules. When I'm working with abused partners, this is one of the things I do with safety planning, is we will talk together about what she can do to have less contact with her abusive partner as they live together, right? So I've done this, you can do this on either side, how to kind of limit contact. This may be, but here with the abusive partner will choose to spend a night away, staying with a friend or someplace else because they're concerned of how they might behave that night. And then of course, a stronger intervention would be to be actually physically separate. Agreeing to a controlled separation, which I'll talk about more in just a moment here. And then probably the most extreme would be to get either, and actually we don't have, I should have one more point here, would be a separation or, leading to a divorce or getting a restraining order. Typically the amount of contact should be significantly influenced by what the abused partner wants, okay? So the more the abused partner wants to limit the contact, the more important it is to limit the contact, okay? Now, I'm not saying that they alone should decide, the abused partner, but certainly they need to be considered, their wishes should be considered, okay? So if it's to the point where they're actually living separately, this is where there's a lot more leverage. I would suggest strongly suggesting that before they move in together, either they start living together or they continue to live together, that the abusive partner is in specialized services, okay? Leverage really drops down and risk really jumps up when they're living together again. So if it's gotten to the point where they're not living together again or they've never lived together again, that's really critical that interventions are done and more substantial changes made before they're actually cohabitating. Okay. You can also suggest moving to a controlled separation. And the other handout you have for me today is a handout on controlled separation. I can't go through that in all the detail that's in the handout. This handout, each of these handouts, the timeout handout and the controlled separation handout, were also written for clients. So of course, they're for you all to read, but each of those are really good to give to your actual clients. Make copies and give to them to explain them to them. So briefly, what a controlled separation is, it's a formal agreement to temporarily limit the contact they are having, okay? The reason why it's a controlled separation is that ultimately the goal is reconciliation, okay? So it's not the same thing as a formal separation or an informal separation. Typically, when a couple separates, the idea is we're separating and we may be done. We're separating because then we're going to get divorced. And a lot of times, they'll treat a separation like it's a divorce. They'll start to spend money differently. They'll have different financial responsibilities. They may start to date. Lots of things happen when you separate. A controlled separation is saying, no. For now, as a controlled separation, the idea is to temporarily separate so that we can reconcile. And what that means is everything else stays the same. You have the exact same financial responsibilities. You have the same rules within the relationship. So unless you had an agreement to non-monogamy before, it's not okay to start now. You're still in the relationship, even if you aren't physically living together. Contact with the children should still be the same at the level that seems right and fair and safe for the children. So all these are part of it, okay? The idea with a controlled separation is to have limited contact. And where you start that limited contact varies from relationship to relationship. And again, it should really be determined by the abused partner. So the most extreme place you could start it is we're gonna have no contact of any kind. We're gonna live separately, no calls, no emails, no texts, nothing. I will contact you when I want that to be different, says the abused partner. So that would be the extreme end of that. And then it goes from there. So for example, they may start at, we're gonna physically live separately, but we can still email and call and text, or we're gonna live separately. And the abused partner will initiate emails and texts, and you can respond to them, but you're not to initiate emails or texts, and so forth and so on. So there are lots of different places you can start this, and the abused partner should be where it's informed. Yeah, go ahead, Janie.
All right, we have a few. From Shanita Wells. Would these techniques be helpful and correct in offering for a caseworker who is assessing child safety and there is known interpersonal violence, and the abusive partner is no longer in a relationship with the partner and is acknowledging toxic behaviors from both parties, not as a substitute, but as a branch towards getting supportive services in place and getting agreement from the abuser. The abusive partner has a pattern with various partners and has strangled a partner in front of a child. That's question one.
Yeah, so I agree with the question. I appreciate your question a lot. What I'm about is that, I'm a frontline worker. I'm dealing with real people with real lives, and we don't want any abuse to be happening. That's our ideal. We want abusive partners to make true changes. In the real world, that doesn't happen overnight. Sometimes it may not happen. So you do what you can. So yes, I think absolutely. These are all Band-Aids. So these are not fixes, but if they can help mitigate some of the abuse, that's something. So I would say, yes, you're welcome to take these things and apply them in other situations as well, like with caseworkers, for example. So I appreciate you raising that point. And as long as it's not seen as a substitute or a cure, it's just a way of doing what we can in the real world to try to limit what's going on. Yes. Was there another, Jane? You're frozen. All right.
No, my internet is really bad right now. I
Okay,
can't
so
get
was there
the
another
weather.
question? that
Yes,
you
there are
had?
two more.
Go ahead.
Stephanie Span asks about timeouts. She asks if there are so many restrictions on how a person takes a timeout, isn't it less likely they're going to take a timeout?
So there are other things they can do. That's, again, appreciate the question. As always, these are great questions. So I could just leave, right? I already mentioned that as an earlier tool. So they could just leave. They could walk away, right? They could set a boundary. I don't want to talk about this right now. They could shelve it. So they could do all those things. Those are not a timeout. Okay. So you're right. A timeout is more complicated on purpose. So, but it's important, so a carburetor, I'm not a mechanic, but bear with me. A carburetor has a lot of different parts to it, but it's only a carburetor if you put all those parts together, right? Yes, a carburetor is complicated, but that's what a carburetor is. A lot of things are called a timeout that aren't a timeout, like walking away or shelving a situation or setting a boundary. These are all other tools, but they're not the same thing as a timeout. So that's why I'm pretty clear, and you're picking up on this correctly. All these steps are what make it a timeout. You can do other things if you want to, just don't call it a timeout. Okay.
And Chris, can I add something?
Please, of course.
All right. So what we see is that even though we have all these guidelines for a timeout, what I see most often is it doesn't prevent guys for taking a timeout, but they'll report taking a timeout, and then we'll ask, well, does it have all these qualities? And most of the time the answer is no. So it's more a criteria to determine, whether they're using timeouts as a form of control or using it in a kind, respectful way, or whether, they're doing, basically. Yeah, I have not seen it deter people from doing it.
Yes.
They'll just simplify it. The second or the third question was from Regina Burke. I work with abusers in a BIP. I don't see separation as a Band-Aid as being effective. In my experience, a concern for cheating would overpower their want to be in a temporary stay away for the night. I have concerns about this even being a possibility. Have you seen this in action with your abusive clients? And if so, how did it go in real life? And then Dina adds that, Dina's also seen this obsession with cheating.
Yeah. So I appreciate the question. Yes, I've seen this done dozens and dozens and dozens of times. So actually, I have a lot of experience with clients doing controlled separations. Now, of course, if you've got somebody who's highly jealous, they're probably not going to agree to it. But that already tells you something. One of the things I say to the abused partner is if the abusive partner won't agree to a controlled separation, that already tells you a lot about their willingness to really respect your wishes. That already tells you a lot about their willingness to make changes. One of the first things they can tell you that they are going to do what they can to try to take your concern seriously is respect the boundary of a controlled separation. So again, typically the controlled separation is going to be initiated by the abused partner, not by the abusive one. Okay. Yes, I've seen it work. I've seen it work very well. I've also seen, and I've seen controlled separations last for one day. I've seen controlled separations last for a week and a half. And I've seen them go on for months and months and months. So they vary a lot. How long they last for, how long they can hold up for varies. They have absolutely been an asset. They have been a huge asset in lots of different ways. So I can say this with high confidence. I've been talking for 25 years about controlled separations and encouraging them. And typically they're happening with voluntary clients, because of course with court-involved clients, there may be other no contact orders or things like that in place. This is for typically voluntary clients. So I've, for many, many years, seen this used, and it works. It works really well, including revealing what is the level of willingness of the abused partner to change. So of course, that's the big question that the abused partners have: is the abusive partner going to change? And their actions will speak far louder than their words. And just one indication is what happens when you suggest a controlled separation. There's no way in hell. All right. And you convey how important it would be to you, how to help you feel safer, blah, blah, blah. All right. Well, that speaks for itself, doesn't it? So yeah, I think controlled separations work very well. Again, primarily with voluntary clients, and they have to be driven by the abused partner. They're the one who indicates this is what I want, and then they also dictate the pace of contact over time. So, and then I would encourage you to read the whole handout. It's like 5 pages long, and I'm happy if any of you all want to email me after today. I'd be happy to continue that more conversation about the practicalities and realities of controlled separations. But this is a tool that I use in my groups, voluntary groups, periodically, and they're hugely helpful in a variety of ways. Not only do they help facilitate process and healing, so they've worked really well, but also in revealing when there's not any real desire to make any real change. So yeah. All right. So the idea behind the amount of contact, and this is all artificial, controlled separation is a contrived situation. It's an overtly contrived situation. The idea is we're only going to have good contact. We're only going to be pleasant to each other. And of course, the smaller the amount of contact, the more public the amount of contact, the more low key the contact, the easier it is for me to be on my best behavior. That's what we want. We want the abusive partner to be on their best behavior. And we're going to extend the amount of time over time that they have to be on their best behavior for. That's the idea. And that it's never more time than they can handle. And as they can handle the limited contact they're having well, it'll grow. That's kind of the ideal. As I said, in the real world, it doesn't always follow that arc, but that would be the ideal, is what's happening. So the benefits for the abused partner is it gives them an immediate break, right? If there's no contact of any kind, there's going to be significantly less abuse. It may not be zero. It can even be abuse when there's no contact at all, but definitely it's going to reduce it. That's the most immediate way. So if you need some sense of safety and freedom right now, even though you don't want to end the relationship, the controlled separation will give you that. Okay. Also, what many abused partners report is even when the abusive partner is behaving fine, if they're cohabitating, they're still on edge. They're still kind of monitoring. They're still vigilant. They're still on eggshells. So especially if that's their lived experience, which is quite common, that's even more of a reason to do a controlled separation. So if he's not around now, I know he's not going to be around, you know, it's nice to know that it's just going to be me and the kids tonight. Okay. And again, there are no illusions or delusions here. They understand that doesn't mean everything's been fixed and made better, but at least I know that there's going to be limited danger. Yeah, go ahead, Jane.
David Rothwell is asking about controlled separation while still living together.
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. Some couples, that's what they want to do. The most common reason why is they're financially they don't have the resources for a separate residence. Okay. And by resources, I mean they don't have the finances. That's the obvious one, but they also don't have family or friend connections. Okay. So if they're relatively socially isolated and they don't have a lot of money, they may not be able to do that. Or there may be practical reasons if they have children and each parent is heavily involved with the child care or things of that nature. So then the idea is, and this is much less, I've dealt with this a number of times too. So again, I'm not just speculating here. I'm speaking from direct experience. The idea then is to do as much as you can to live in separate orbits, right? So again, if this is a wealthier couple where they have like two or three stories to their house, like a basement and then 2 floors, he'll sleep in the basement and mainly hang out in the basement, and she'll be on the main floor. Or, they'll have separate parts of the house. Now, of course, with a less wealthy couple, that may not be possible. So then again, what they're trying to do, the idea is to limit as much contact as you can. Okay. So if she's in the living room, you're in the bedroom, right? If she's in the kitchen, then you can be in the living room. And, the idea is, and this is not about doing the cold shoulder. This is nothing about, or, doing stuff like that. It's just limiting our interactions. I can remember one couple that had a pretty small house, single floor. I think it was just 1 bedroom, 1.5 bedrooms. She actually put a dividing line down the center of the small house, and you stay on that side and I'll let her stay on this side. It was very creative. So yes, people can try to do that while living together. As you'd expect, so much easier to violate those boundaries, but it can make a difference. I have seen even that help some. Go ahead, Jane.
Stephanie T, sorry if I mispronounced your last name, asks, to better understand controlled separation, does that still include sexual contact? And what types of contact is encouraged? And do they sign some type of agreement with the conditions to hold them accountable?
So no. So again, this is all survivor centered. This is all abused partner centered. So the abused partner is the one who gets, this is really about empowering and strengthening the voice and the will of the abused partner. So they will determine how much contact to have. They will determine when that contact shifts. That will include sexual contact. I will just say in general, this may come as a surprise to you. Abusive behavior, it's a libido killer. Go figure. Abusive behavior is like anti-foreplay. Okay. A very common complaint that abusive partners have is the fact that they're not having the same kind of physical and sexual intimacy. I'm talking about in general now, unrelated to controlled separations. But since you mentioned that. So the pace of increased contact, the nature of the contact, all that should be driven by the abused partner. And again, great question. If you read the full handout, like the 5-page fan, I think that's spelled out pretty well. I want to be very careful about signing contracts because this is more of an informal agreement. And it's going to evolve and shift a lot. So I would not put something in writing that they sign. And again, it's really driven by the abused partner. Okay. So we've only got 10 minutes left. So let me see if I can power through the few of these slides here. And then I'm also happy to hang out and answer questions after the 2 hours if people have them and want to hang around. So the benefit of a controlled separation for the abusive partner is it's a way of showing that they're serious about making changes, showing that they're willing to address the concerns that the abused partner has. It also gives them a chance to not dig the hole deeper, right? So every act of abuse is further digging them in a deeper hole. It's further eating away at any goodwill, trust, love. All abuse is corrosive that way and toxic that way. So again, if you want to get out of a hole, the first thing you need to do is stop digging. In other words, you need to stop or diminish your abusive behavior as much as possible. Controlled separation helps with that. And it allows an abusive partner to do more of their own work away from the family or away from their partner and learning how to walk on their own 2 feet more emotionally. All right. So restraining orders. Jennifer talked about this. Restraining orders vary a little bit from state to state. And I will tell you, there are a lot of cons to restraining orders. And Jennifer talked to some of this in her presentation. So a restraining order is not for everybody. Restraining orders can actually make things worse. Restraining orders will not stop somebody who's set on abusing you or killing you. Okay. And we have people who are abused and killed all the time while they have restraining orders. But they can make a difference. So I just want to mention those as an option. Okay, so I talk about 5 tools. We're at number 3, not giving themselves permission to be abusive. The reality is any abusive partner has in their head, whether they're aware of it or not, a list of things that they are willing to do to be abusive. They also have a list of things they would not be willing to do as being an abusive partner. In other words, they are always giving themselves permission to be abusive. Okay, so for example, a common thing that abusive partners will give themselves permission to do is yell. Common thing that many will do is give themselves permission to call names. However, calling their partner a cunt, that is something that some abusive partners will never, ever, ever do. They will not give themselves permission to use the C word, for example, which is one of the ugliest words you can say to a woman, right? In an abusive way. So they won't give themselves permission to do that, and they never, ever will. And their partner will vouch for that. So the idea is to lengthen the list of things they aren't willing to do. Okay. Now it's not just as simple as just say no to abuse. So John, here's the deal. You have to agree not to be abusive ever again. Okay. Can you just agree to that right now? Thank you. Now we're done. It's not that simple. But what they might be willing to do is not do any of the more extreme types of abuse that they typically do, whatever extreme means for them. All right. So they're not giving themselves permission to kind of shorten the list, to keep it realistic that way. All right. You can read the rest of that slide. Another thing is to encourage them to modify their alcohol and drug use. I want to make it clear that while some abusive partners do have addiction issues, others do not. So I'm not just talking to somebody with an active addiction. This could be somebody who is not an alcoholic. Typically, they drink very responsibly. It's not been an issue. However, they do acknowledge that almost always the time they become, sometimes they're abusive when they're sober, but other times they're abusive when they've had a drink or two. And they might acknowledge that actually, and this is not unusual, is it's when I and my partner have both been drinking a little bit that some of the worst abuse happens. And when I say drinking a little bit, I mean that they are having like two drinks. So we're not talking about somebody who's completely wasted. We're talking about even moderate alcohol or drug use can contribute to abusive behavior. So having them examine that, is there a connection between the way you drink or use and your abuse? And if so, maybe you need to change that. And then the final one is identifying higher risk situations. The reality is it's very unusual that an abusive partner has the exact same level of risk of being abusive all day long across every situation. Okay. And so the idea here around this kind of safety planning is when are the times and circumstances that you're most likely to be abusive, and zero in on those. And this can include when specific issues come up, like if we talk about the finances or the parenting. It might be particular interactions that happen, like when your partner wants to be sexual, or like when the kids won't listen to bedtime. It may be specific times. So some common times that we see abusive behavior happening is late in the evening when people are very tired. Just after they get home from work, when they're transitioning is another common time. And then Sunday evenings. And the Sunday evening one is the transition from the weekend to the work week. These are, for example, are sometimes. Or there might be certain circumstances when they're much more prone to being abusive, such as they're running late or if the house is a mess. And so the idea then is that there are higher risk times is can we come up with concrete action plans to how to navigate for those higher risk situations right then. Okay. All right. And then some final reminders about this. Don't confuse one last time, to repeat myself and to risk being controlling myself by badgering you all. Don't confuse the short-term safety planning we're talking today with longer-term change work in abusive partners and longer-term safety work in abused partners, right? That this is really only Band-Aids that we're doing, okay? And then that's contact information. So I know we're just about at time. We just got a couple minutes left, but any final questions or comments folks have before we wrap things up? So otherwise, for those who made it through all 4 webinars, all 8 hours, congratulations. Thank you all. It's been great, like, remotely interacting with you all. For those of you who are looking at this afterwards, if you're looking at these on YouTube, please spread the word. So I want to do just a little bit of promo. Please get the word out that these webinars are available. Now, people after the fact won't be able to get CEUs, but they can still access these. And the whole intent we're making them, and deep appreciation to Rowan and the Oregon Coalition for willing to sponsor these things. Our hope is that ultimately thousands of people, thousands of mental health professionals will be watching these things and learning from them. And if you're somebody who's watching it remotely, you're welcome to reach out to me with emails or what have you. I can provide additional support. But thank you all for attending, and take care, and good luck.
Ooh, and now some questions are coming in.
Real quick, while you're reading through the questions, I just wanted to say I'll be sending out the blank evaluation form to everyone who attended shortly. And then if you would just email that back to me, I'll put my email in the chat, and I'll be able to get CEUs for y'all. And it's also available in the 4th session folder.
So a question from Mikola. What are some things that increase the chances of a survivor/victim following through with the safety plan?
Oh, Jennifer, you want to take that one?
Can you repeat it again?
What increases the chances of a survivor following through with a safety plan?
Yeah, I'm going to emphasize the whole warm handoff thing, right? Like if you're given a crisis line, call together, describe exactly what they can expect, connect them to a specific person, encourage them to practice the safety plan. Practice really, really helps, and having, like backup alternatives.
Next one. What should a survivor do or older adult children do if their abusive parent doesn't see their behavior as abuse?
Yes, so I guess I would say also that most services for survivors also address elder abuse, and there are separate services for child abuse. And so definitely you can call those same hotline numbers. You can get that same advice for safety planning, right? You can get that same kind of support regardless of the type of relationship. If there's family violence happening, there's support out there.
And, oh, Chris, yeah, you.
So no, go ahead. So I'm not sure I understood the question.
I'm not quite sure I did either. I don't know if
Say it again.
Collis
Say it one more
Baker.
time.
Okay, yeah. Or Collis Baker Stewart, if you want to type it in again or rephrase.
Say it one more time. I
could
think I
help,
know
like-
what they're getting at, but let me just hear it
Okay.
again.
What should a survivor do, or should older adult children do, if their abusive parent doesn't see their behavior as abuse?
Right.
Interestingly,
Yes.
Chris and I see abusive partners who are in services with us, kind of working on their abuse, who kind of complain or recognize their abusive parents not recognizing their abuse.
Yes,
so
they
we
do.
see this with abusive partners and survivors.
So
having
this
an
is very
interest.
common. So your question, yeah, it's actually question's clear. It's very common. Many abusive partners do not see what they're doing as abusive, especially if they don't do any physical abuse. It's very common. And there are lots of ways you can deal with that. It really depends on the level of authority you have. Part of it is to point out the specific behavior. If you have more authority and more power, you can point out the specific behaviors. So when you yell at me, that's verbal abuse. And that's a problem. That's not okay. When you call me names, that's verbal abuse. Like when you call me stupid, that's not a name, that's still verbal abuse. So part of it's to tag it and to name it and label it. There's a lot more we could say, but this is very common. In fact, that's more the norm, is abusive partners to say, I wasn't abusive. What are you talking about? That wasn't abuse, especially if they're not being physically abusive. I mean, they'll even do that with physical abuse. So yeah, I mean, we could talk all day about that. Part of that is whether you think you're abusive or not. If you want to stay in this marriage, you need to go there. You need to go to Allies and Change and get help for that. So that's another thing, is whether you think you have a problem or not, you need to go engage in services. That's another common thing that's the case. We see this among our court involved people too. They don't have to come in thinking they have a problem. They just have to come in. Okay. What's key is that while they're with us, they need to realize that they do have a problem. So they don't have to come in thinking they have a problem, as long as they realize while they're with us that they do.
And in terms of what the survivor should do, your plan can't hinge on someone else changing their behavior or even acknowledging or recognizing it, right? You still have control over what you have control over, and you make a plan to keep yourself safe, and to, whether it's limiting contact or being away from that person, you do what you can do to keep you safe regardless of what they do or believe.
Or anything else?
Controlled separation question from Douglas Marlowe. This is I'm happy to save this for a consultation appointment. I have a wife who requested a break from sexuality because it felt controlling. The wife wanted to be free to initiate sexual engagement. The husband, in what felt like a controlling way, said, if I can't initiate sex, then you can't either. It's not fair. How would you handle it?
That's a longer conversation. To me, this is a broader issue around respecting boundaries. And the more general issue, Douglas, I would say, is that part of this is the platinum rule: treat other people the way they want to be treated. Part of this is acknowledging differences. And for lots of things, is that either one of us gets to be able to say no. And that's probably what I hear happening. So I think it's really more around that feels really retaliatory what the other person did. And I think it's common, and certainly this is some common thing we see with couples who have different levels of sexual interest. Is it's common that the person who has a lower level of sexual interest is going to be the one taking more of the initiative, because the presumption is that, you know, if the lower interest one is interested, the higher interest one will be too, but the flip won't be the case. And if the one with the greater interest is consistently taking the initiative, that can start to feel like badgering or pressuring or things of that nature. So this is a common thing that we see with a variety of behaviors, but I think it's a longer conversation.
Real quick, another thing that I like to do is offer a little bit of psychoeducation to men about how and any sort of controlling, coercive, unwanted sex also is going to affect arousal, and it requires ongoing repeated experiences of safety and boundaries being respected in order to regain the ability to be turned on at all. And I I recommend some psychoed too. It can help with motivation. A question for CEUs, that's for you, Rowan, in the chat. Sorry, I see you just answered it. Never mind. All right.
I answered it like right as you pointed it out.
All right, is that it then? All right, so thank you all for staying on. Wish you well, take care.